En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Todos los días escuchamos que el mundo que conocemos ya no es el mismo. Tenemos más información y más tecnología que nunca, pero persisten las desigualdades sociales al tiempo que aumenta la temperatura del planeta y sentimos las consecuencias en nuestro entorno diario. El horizonte parece incierto, pero nosotros creemos que hay un gran poder de cambio en cada decisión que tomamos, en la forma como vivimos y las metas que perseguimos. En el Grupo Bancolombia estamos convencidos de que es posible un mejor futuro. Por eso, hoy renovamos nuestro compromiso para trabajar decididamente por un propósito común, que nos recuerde a los 30.000 empleados de la organización por qué nos levantamos todos los días. Promovemos desarrollo económico sostenible para lograr el bienestar de todos, impulsando que las cosas pasen con prosperidad, pensando siempre a largo plazo, para que podamos vivir con satisfacción y tranquilidad, todos y nadie se quede por fuera. Bancolombia, Banismo, Banco Agrícola y BAM. Sabemos que aunque somos diferentes, tenemos mucho en común. Este propósito es nuestra razón de ser. Refleja eso que nos apasiona y lo que mejor sabemos hacer, reconociendo que lo que nos hace sentir orgullosos de hacer parte de esta organización es la convicción con que enfrentamos los retos de la sociedad. Nuestro propósito también habla de elevar juntos el bienestar de nuestros países con más y mejores oportunidades. Empleados, colaboradores, usuarios, clientes, accionistas. Todos, desde nuestro rol, podemos cambiar el mundo un paso a la vez, teniendo claro que un mismo propósito nos inspira a trabajar por el bienestar de todos. Nos sentimos orgullosos de decir que en el Grupo Bancolombia promovemos desarrollo económico sostenible para lograr el bienestar de todos.
Te invitamos a conversar sobre cómo podemos seguir avanzando juntos en la ruta de la sostenibilidad, porque más importante que ganar el año es aprender. Más importante que los resultados es la forma en que los alcanzamos, comprometidos con el desarrollo armónico de la sociedad y trabajando para hacerlo mejor todos los días.
Buenas tardes. Tengo que decir que el evento será conducido en inglés, pero hay traducción simultánea disponible siguiendo las instrucciones en la descripción del video. ¿Listo? Bueno. Okay, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation about cultural journalism in the time of pandemia as part of the program of the 8th Festival Gabo. My name's Jonathan Levi, and I'm talking to you from Rome, so buenas noches, it's 7 o'clock here. I'm an occasional journalist who began 40 years ago as one of the founding editors of Granta magazine. And more recently, I'm a novelist, the author of several novels, including Septimania, which was recently published in Colombia by Elena Rajo. And I've run arts festivals in the United States and in Europe, and participated both in the Hay Festival in Cartagena and as well as the Classical Music Festival in Cartagena. And though I've never been to the Festival Gabo in Medellin, I visited your beautiful city many, many times when my eldest daughter, Rebecca, lived there for a few years. And most recently, it was at the Feria del Libro in Medellin 2 years ago. Also, over the past 8 years, I've had the honor to be the co-director of the Gabo Fellowship in Cultural Journalism, which is a fellowship in which we gather 15 mid-career journalists from around the world to come to the Caribbean coast that was so central to the life and work of Gabo during his lifetime, with the help of guest masters from Latin America and from others who are preeminent in their fields. And that's why 1 year ago, I had the pleasure of inviting Jason King to Cartagena as a guest master for the Gabo Fellowship in Cultural Criticism. Now, Jason King is a founding faculty member at New York University's Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music, where he's an associate professor, director of global studies, and director of writing, history, and emergent media studies. A journalist for publications like Pitchfork and NPR Music, as well as a musician, DJ, and producer, King is the author of the Michael Jackson Treasures, and he has been an expert witness in copyright infringement cases for Katy Perry, Jay-Z, Timbaland, Lady Gaga, Madonna, and many others. He was the host and co-producer of National Public Radio's Noteworthy, the curator of NPR&B, NPR's 24/7 R&B radio channel, and the host of CNN's original podcasts, Soundtracks. In other words, a complete gentleman. So welcome, Jason. Great to see you again.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Jason, by the way, is coming to us from New York. So one of the great advantages of not doing the festival live with you in Medellin is that Jason and I on 2 different continents can join you in yet a third one. Now, Jason, when you and I last met a year ago, it was on the occasion of the Caribbean Cultural Market down in Cartagena, where dozens of arts and music and dance groups came together to try and sell their wares to producers from all over. Well, it's been a crazy year since then, huh?
I mean, I can't even believe it. I was just kind of smiling widely just to be here and to see you and just to think about how much has transpired over the course of a year and where we were 1 year ago and how much fellowship there was and kind of conviviality and how we just enjoyed each other's presence. And then here we are, using technology to produce the same type of effect. So it's a strange year.
It's been a long, strange trip. Well, Jason and I are going to talk for about the next 45 minutes about cultural journalism during this past year of COVID and of social protest and what it's meant to cultural journalists. And then we've got some time at the end for those of you in the audience to ask us questions. So as we're talking along, feel free to write any questions along in the chat box, and those will be passed on to us. But before we get on to talking about cultural journalism, talk to me about this last year, Jason, in terms of what sticks in your mind as events from this last year.
I mean, I think the obvious thing of course, is the pandemic, but it's the way in which the pandemic has changed the way that we think about the flow of information, how we process information, our capacity to process information as readers. And as a writer, as a journalist, I've really had to think about what my role is in the midst of a pandemic. It's a noisy year. There's just a lot of information that's circulating. And so you want to think about how it is best for you to share the knowledge that you have, your ability to write and to be able to communicate your thoughts about the time that we live in a way that doesn't just sort of add to the noise, but actually intervenes in a way that is meaningful and useful. And of course, besides the pandemic, there's also been numerous protests, lots of which were, of course, sparked by the tragic murder of George Floyd in the US, and that kind of rippled outward. But there were protests happening before that as well. But of course, I think that moment in the summer, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a lot of others who were tragically murdered in the United States there was like a catalyst, right, that created this really powerful moment of global protests that I think we all had to find ways to respond to and think about. So all of that to say, I feel like cultural journalists at this point have such an incredibly important role at being able to help contextualize the events of the year, in ways that are sophisticated, in ways that are that represent the complexity of these events. They are more and more responsible for representing diverse viewpoints, helping us interpret culture from an intersectional perspective. And I think that's been emboldening for me. That's been inspiring to know that journalists' role, even as publications become challenged by their ability to stay afloat financially and so on, journalists, writers have become incredibly important in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about it in terms of this year, I remember that when I think you and I both arrived in Colombia, you arrived a few days after I did, but the night that I arrived, my plane was delayed, and so it would arrive after midnight because there was a curfew that was put into place in Bogota because of the social protests that were going on there, that in fact were following on the social protests that were going on in Chile at the time. And we, I think many of us felt that, well, this was going to be a year of social protests. None of us knew about this virus. Or if we had heard anything about the virus in China, none of us thought it was going to come on towards us. But let's talk a little bit for a moment about the social protests. I mean, I get the feeling that much of what was going on in Colombia and in Chile was very similar to what was going on in the United States, that there was unhappiness that existed before this last year, but that it seemed that all of a sudden there was either more violence on the part of the authorities, or there was more awareness of violence on the part of authorities. What's your sense? I mean, quite frankly, here we are. I'm a white guy, you're not, and my awareness, and perhaps what's happened in this past year, is that my awareness on the part of white people has been heightened of various types of protests and injustices that have been more than obvious to the community of color, both in North and South America.
Sure. I mean, I think we have to put it in context, right? So to me, it's been at least a decade of what I wrote about for Pitchfork as the decade of awakening, right? So it's not to say that there weren't protests before, let's say the Arab Spring or Occupy in the late 2000s or early 2010s, but it really has been a decade of mobilization, of activism, of political crises that have had the response of people taking to the streets to actually talk about the nature of their conditions. And of course, within Latin America, Haiti, Honduras, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, there have been protests in 2019, especially, but like when we look at it globally, if we think about Hong Kong, we think about the US, this has literally been a decade of protests and people understanding themselves to be activists in a different way than we had seen before. And not just, again, organizers and mobilizers, but everybody sort of has had to think about their relationship to activism in a little bit of a different way. And so people have been protesting for a number of different reasons, right? Some of which are interlocking, but a lot of it has to do with economic upheaval. A lot of it, of course, has to do with political unrest. But I do think there's often a catalyzing moment. And in the US, I think that was the death of George Floyd, in tandem with the way in which the pandemic operated as a kind of X-ray that illuminated these larger structural and tractable issues that had existed in not just the US, not just in Latin America, but all around the world. The pandemic shone a light on all of that and demonstrated to people that, we need to find a way to sustain people's humanities and to be able to allow people to have shelter over their heads and to, have meals on their tables and so on. And all of that came into, I think, great relief, in the age of the pandemic, because people realized, all right, if this happens, I don't have a paycheck. I can't actually feed my family. I can't do the things that I need to do. And so I think this year has revealed for a lot of people how tenuous their lives are. It's revealed how precarious people actually live in many ways, and that vulnerable communities are even more vulnerable when there are natural disasters or when there are pandemics that race across the world and threaten people's ability to just fully live and just to be human beings. And so I think that's what this year has demonstrated, the deepness of the structural issues.
It's striking and perhaps very depressing that it took a pandemic to actually do that. I mean, the history of social protest is a long one, and some might say that 1776 was the beginning of social protest in the United States. Others might see that the history of the United States goes back a little bit further than that. But that also in Latin America, that the journalist Eduardo Galeano from Uruguay, who wrote Open Veins of America, which is a great book that forced us to look at the Americas and the conquest of the Americas in a different type of light, was hailed as somewhat of a revolutionary piece of writing that was going to somehow shape not only South America. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela gave a copy of the book to Barack Obama when he entered the White House, and Galeano himself said to Obama, I think that he said the White House will be Obama's house in the time coming, but this White House was built by black slaves, and I hope that he never forget this. And yet, in a way, it took the pandemic to bring this as a reminder to the American people. I'm wondering, because there were other projects that were trying to raise these issues of inequality, issues of how the White House was built by black slaves to the fore. Did you feel that they never really sort of took hold and took root until the pandemic came along?
Well,
until the killing of George Floyd.
Yeah, I think what the killing of George Floyd revealed again is the deep structural issues, right, that affect people and their ability to live on a daily basis. So while there has been a lot of fantastic cultural journalism that has done that work of trying to actually address structural issues, I feel like people were ready now to hear about the nuanced, complex ways in which structures of oppression sustain themselves and endure. And I think that was a shift for me this year. And so I think there's been a lot of great examples of that, and how journalists have actually been trying to not just address racism, but actually to address structural racism, right? And to really think about the ways in which structural racism is embedded into the way that people live. So for instance, I think the 1619 Project is one of those. And just for those who don't know, the 1619 Project is a project that was started by the New York Times Magazine. The project creator was Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was a Black woman who created this journalistic initiative that ultimately won the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. And her goal, and the goal of the 1619 Project, was to basically reframe and recontextualize US history by actually centering slavery and its aftermath, and centering Black contributions in the United States and globally as central, right, to the American project. So normally, or not normally, but sometimes slavery is seen as a sin that happened in America or happened to America, that is part of the past and that doesn't need further elaboration because slaves were freed, we moved on. And if you're complaining now about issues related to economic inequality, structural economic inequality, et cetera, you have to deal with those issues on your own, and you have to find a way to deal with them as communities, but it's not related to the past. So part of what the 1619 Project was doing, I think, is reframing, recontextualizing slavery and saying slavery is not a past sin, but it's a present sin. And it's actually counteracting some disinformation, right, about slavery. I mean, there were textbooks that were written that were saying, slaves came to the United States to get jobs, right? That's a gross oversimplification of history, and it's just wrong. So what she was trying to do, and what 1619 Project was trying to do is to show how slavery resonates in the racial conditions of the present. And of course, they did this tied to the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia in 1619. But one of the things I just want to bring up about that project and why it's so important, clearly it's a 2019 project, not just a 2020 project, but it was ongoing, right? The idea of the project is that it would be open-ended, and it wasn't just journalism, it was visual, it was interactive, it was multimedia, it was multi-format. There were essays, symposiums, poems, photographs, live events. It was a podcast series. It's becoming a book. I think they're also doing a series, a TV series on it. It was also collaborative. It wasn't just Nikole Hannah-Jones. It was other writers and reporters who were involved. And it actually ended up stirring up a lot of interest in people wanting to buy the New York Times print version, right? This online interactive initiative. So I think of this as a kind of event journalism. It's an activist journalism and it's event journalism that was in 2019, but I think opened up the floodgates for what was possible in 2020 in terms of producing a kind of journalism that's almost like, I almost call it like rock star journalism, because it's like, it's polarizing, but it's disruptive, right? In the way that like good rock music is supposed to be disruptive to establishment culture. It came in and it shook up the establishment and got a lot of people upset and angry. Conservatives like Newt Gingrich and even Donald Trump, who thought it was a kind of brainwashing and propaganda. But you know, also certain kind of liberal writers and historians also had a reaction to it too. They were concerned about issues of historical accuracy. But I think what 1619 Project did, which is really important, is it forced us to really think about who gets to tell history, who gets to frame culture, who are the people who've historically been able to do this, and what does it mean when you have different people, including Black women, who now get to reframe and recontextualize this history and actually reveal the deeper structural implications of that history.
No, it's interesting what you say in terms of it having both an explanatory effect, but also a polarizing effect, the 1619 Project. I was reading, I think it was even just yesterday in the New York Times, another Black woman, the writer Ayanna Mathis, wrote a very interesting piece about James Baldwin and about his growing up in the Black evangelist church and the way that she did. And she said that Baldwin was forged in the crucible of an America perpetually teetering on the edge of self-destruction, unwilling to heed the warnings of those who understood the immensity of the peril. The result of that heedlessness, as we've seen in these pandemic months, is quite literally death. And while I think that that's one of these kind of statements that at least 100% of Americans would agree with, where they might differ is on what's the imminent cause of the self-destruction. I think half of them would blame, white supremacism, would blame racism, would blame conservatism. And the other half, as you were mentioning, Newt Gingrich and Donald Trump would blame liberalism. So the question is all of this stuff now coming up to the fore? Is it something that can be solved? And where is the place of journalists in terms of trying to make sense of this polarization?
I mean, I would turn that question to you as well, Jonathan, to ask what you think. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I have a little bit of ambivalence. I mean, there's now I think that within the frame of COVID, that we're doing much less of what journalists generally do, which is go out and see stuff, because we can't. We're more isolated. I mean, to the extent that we believe that journalists do three things, which is they observe, they analyze, and then they finally communicate their results. It feels to me like we're spending a lot more time analyzing stuff and explaining, and that there's a lot more of what I think in your and my discussion we've called explanatory journalism. And there's something very good about that. I think a lot of people turn to the newspapers, they turn to the graphs that they see in the newspapers, and they ask journalists, explain to me what this means. Explain to me today, Britain just started giving COVID vaccines today. Is it safe? Someone tell me. Is it going to be safe in the United States? How often is it going to protect me? Blah, blah, blah. explain, explain. But personally, I feel that sometimes journalists get themselves tied up in explaining, and that sometimes people don't want to be explained to. Many people have said that Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016 because she seemed like one of those Eastern managers who goes out to Detroit to the auto plants and explains what they've been doing wrong all these years. You know, all these guys who have been working and know the auto industry very well. And no, the experts are going to come out and explain to you what's going on. So I think I think we're finding ourselves in a difficult moment. Also, because as soon as we explain, in a way, we expose our prejudices. You know, we let people know where we're coming from, and it's very hard to convince them that we're coming from some kind of middle line in which we're taking a neutral position and just giving them facts.
But I can't imagine this year without explanatory journalism. And so what I mean by that is like reporting that is helping readers trying to make sense of the world, because the world has become more complicated, more nuanced. There's a lot of information. There's information overload out there. And so it becomes journalists' responsibility to try to help readers know and understand government and policy and technical issues and so on. But this is not just about the political world. This is also happening in all kinds of cultural journalism. So even in music journalism, for instance, Vox has its discussions about how music is made. Song Exploder, the podcast, right, is really about explaining and deconstructing songs themselves and explaining to people how they're made. And now it's become a Netflix series. The rise of music documentaries, the proliferation of them is also about explaining things that people would otherwise find mystifying or complicated. But I, for instance, this year have turned to The Atlantic for their exceptional coverage on the pandemic. And I think of that journalism as fantastic explanatory journalism, because the writers are able to take a lot of information that's coming at you and put it in a very succinct way that helps you understand the issues. And I think this is incredibly important in an age of disinformation. I think we can't pretend like we don't live in an age in which there's deliberate strategic disinformation that's happening, not just in the US, but in places like Brazil and, where the governments are deliberately trying to disinform the populations about really important public health issues. And so that's one thing that journalists are doing. And I also think that journalists have become responsible for taking topics that had formerly been relegated to the academy or to the university. So topics, for instance, related to race, like intersectionality, or looking at the structural machinations of sexual abuse in the Me Too era. A lot of this conversation had been happening at Black studies departments in the US or at gender studies departments and so on. And that language has become much more mainstream. And if you go to Twitter, you'll see people talking about misogyny and structural racism in ways that we wouldn't have seen maybe 15 years ago. So journalists have also become important for helping explain complex issues related to identity and related to politics that I think is essential right now. So that part of the explanatory thing, I think, is meaningful.
Well, I think there's one thing that cultural journalism also does very well, which is by using the excuse of culture, talking about something that you find in the back pages of the newspaper, that somehow you can get ideas around to people that they think would normally be on the front pages and persuade them of it. Which is awfully hard, persuading people these days, because I think people go to the news, they go to journalism in order to reinforce what they believe already. And that's why we've got this war of facts. I mean, it's just, I was just reading a novel by Colin McCann, The Paragon, about a Palestinian father and an Israeli father who both lose their daughters. And there's an extraordinary scene in which the Palestinian, while he's in prison for 7 years, happens to see a film about the Holocaust, and all of a sudden this changes everything about what he thinks. I think that's a wonderful moment of fiction, but it seems entirely like fiction. I mean,
Sounds very fictional. Yeah.
He's tornadoes picked him up and he's gone over the rainbow and he's in Oz. People are just not, if you hit them straight on, they're not changing their minds. But if you go through the back door, they might listen. And there's a piece that there's a piece of yours that I read about the Tootsie Shuffle, about Drake.
Tootsie Slide.
The Tootsie Slide. Sorry, the Tootsie Slide. This is what happens when a dad tries to pretend he knows what he's talking about. But it was a fantastic article because the things that you talk about, for people who don't know, and I think I was the only person on earth who didn't know about the Tootsie Slide before I watched the video and read Jason's article. It's a song that Drake videoed, that he recorded and then videoed in Toronto in his 50,000 square foot mansion, essentially alone. And it's as much it's a film about isolation. We see isolation as he moves through through his house that looks like it could be a suburban mall or a museum or who the hell knows, but a house. How many of us have seen a house like this? And there he is, not only all alone, but dressed in a hoodie and with a mask up to his face. I think, as you mentioned, if someone had just come along, they would have pulled a gun on him and said, "What are you doing in this house? That you're robbing this place." And that in the course of your article, Jason, what I found fascinating was that you were able to do what I think, but as a journalist, what a lot of other academics would do, which is talk about what is the place of, or what historically has been the place of the Black male, both outside and inside. What does outside and inside mean to them? For most of us, quarantine and isolation, for most of us who aren't people of color, quarantine and isolation are a pain in the ass, but they're not weighted with all the freight that you bring up. And so, there's a sense that cultural journalism of this sort can, in fact, find this moment, especially when we're in quarantine and we have lots of time in our hands to watch videos like the Tootsie Slide and read articles to somehow have our minds educated.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking about information overload, but it's also just been a really bad news year. There's just such bad news that you're having to deal with on a constant basis. I don't know if other people feel this way, but I have to sometimes shut the TV off. I have to turn off my phone. I can't process any more information. And one of the things people do is they escape to Netflix or wherever else to try to get away from the news. But it was interesting to me that in popular culture, particularly in TikTok, if I was looking at popular music, there was a real emphasis on dancing this year. And so what I wanted to do in writing this piece that I wrote for the Het Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam for their music video series, I wanted to be able to write a piece that explained where we were and how we are living now, and how the way that we are living now has changed in the age of the pandemic and in the age of racial justice protests that have gone global. But to do it through the lens of this 4-minute, 3-minute music video by Drake, that to me contains the multitudes. I watched that video about just Drake dancing in his $100 million home in Toronto. And it made me think, I see how culture is shifting just in that video, right? So there's a connection between the idea of making a viral video, and it became a huge video this year that everybody was dancing to and made their response videos, making a viral video and living in a moment of a viral pandemic, right? And he made the video for this pandemic moment, wanting us to move in our homes at a time in which certain kinds of movement has become restricted globally. And so that seemed to me to be an interesting kind of juxtaposition, or maybe an irony in the culture, that I wanted to kind of work out and think about through the lens of Drake. And then to think about the relationship between indoor and outdoor, because so much is happening in his home. And as you mentioned, for a Black man to be in his home with a mask on and a hoodie, dressed in this particular way, evoked all these images of Black criminality that have been so problematic and so freighted. And so it struck me that he was playing with those images at a time in which the idea of certain kind of Black people going outside is freighted, right? So thinking about somebody like George Floyd being killed outside, right? But also somebody like Breonna Taylor being killed inside her home. And so the very meaning of home for people in an age of income inequality, wealth inequality, tied into racial inequality, gender inequality, it struck me that a lot of this was being illuminated in Drake's video itself. And so I think there's a lot of work that cultural journalists can do to look at aspects of our culture, particularly popular culture, film, movies, etc., and to see the ways in which those works of popular culture are resonating with the larger issues that are happening in the culture, politically and socially and otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Thinking of the way that film is coming to us these days, especially now that most movie theaters are closed and we're just getting film through streaming. One of our students for this year's Becca Gabo is a Chilean film critic, and told me that wrote a wonderful article actually about Pedro Lemebel, who is who died about 5 years ago, who was a gay censored writer in Chile. And a film was made of one of his novels, My Tender Matador, and it just showed up, on the internet, didn't have any kind of theatrical release, and was seen and sold more tickets than any other film that had been made in Chile in the past, 10 or 20 years. A film about a subject that essentially had been censored in high schools. His books had been censored, had been pulled out of a number of high schools because of the gay content. So I'm wondering, as we talk about, this year of pandemic and this year of social unrest, is there a silver lining to being stuck inside? Are we seeing more interesting art come out of the pandemic than we did before? Things that are more thoughtful.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I have a single answer to that. I think there's been a huge amount of really fascinating work, some of which was created before the pandemic, but magically kind of resonates with the pandemic. One of the biggest global pop albums of the year is Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia. And it's a dance album that was made before the pandemic, but released in the spring. And most people would say, well, what's the point of a dance record? Like, kind of looking back to the old days of disco and so on in this moment, but it's incredibly meaningful at a time in which people are in their homes and in which artists are mostly doing work out of their homes, in which journalists are doing work out of their homes.
Except let me ask you a question about that album, because again, you brought that to my attention, and I think it's fun, but I then saw Dua Lipa has been actually quite active as a social activist, and for I would say the kind of causes that we like, the left-wing causes or reasonable causes. But do you think we'd like the album so much, we'd dance to it so much, if, let's say, she was a pro-gun activist, and if she was a white supremacist, and if she was, it's how much are our feelings about culture now dictated by where artists lie on the political spectrum?
Wow. I mean, I think very much so. I think, again, I think the events of this year have made people exhausted and fatigued, right, with certain viewpoints that seek to reduce or circumscribe their humanity. So, a good example of this would be the Harper's letter. And for those who don't know, this was a letter that was published on Harper's Magazine. It was spearheaded by Thomas Chatterton Williams, the writer. And basically, this open letter, it was called A Letter on Justice and Open Debate. The point of it was to defend free speech, right? To denounce cancel culture, and to say that cancel culture, the idea of just no platforming somebody or canceling them out of the culture because of their political perspective, is really a problem of liberalism gone wrong, right? And you have to end cancel culture. And the way to do that is to stop liberals from expressing themselves in a way that is about trying to cancel people. And so they had 153 kind of very important elite cultural figures, including many, many important journalists and writers. You had David Frum, David Brooks was in there, Margaret Atwood, fiction writers, Grail Marcus, the music journalist. J.K. Rowling, signatory who has been on record as being kind of anti-trans. So to me, you know, we're at a point where there's this huge polarization, especially around the issue of cancel culture and call out culture. And cultural journalists are at the center of that in a lot of ways. But the issue I had, I mean, Jonathan, you were aware when the letter came out and all of that. What were your thoughts?
Sure. Well, my feeling, I've had, shall we say, evolving feelings about this because, you know, essentially I'm given any particular argument. I think that argument should be one that's open to debate. We should be able to have a free interchange of ideas. As I started to think about that letter, the problem was that the letter didn't speak about anything in particular. It just spoke about a general type of cancel culture that was going on. And at the same time as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about some of the ads that were going on that essentially, you know, I forget exactly how they went, but they said, you know, that for Black people in the United States, you know, when we protested, you told us to calm down. You know, when we kneeled, like Colin Kaepernick, you know, you told us that we were unpatriotic. You know, when we did this, so that I saw, okay, put these two things together, and does the letter, the Harper's letter, come off as yet again another one of the things in this type of sequence? In other words, that people are protesting whether they're Black or whether they're gay or whether they're, you know, whatever their positions are. And they're saying, you're trying to deny us the right of protesting. This is another form of protest. Fine, you know, stop our protests, but change something systemic in the culture before you're going to do that. And that's what struck me as being the most problematic, is that in any discourse, and I think in a way journalists have the responsibility to try and be as specific as possible, to not try and be general. That when you're general, what happens is it starts to look like, you know, you've got some type of axe to grind, as opposed to you're talking about a specific issue. And
sure.
That's what bothered me about the Harper's letter, was that generality.
For me, I mean, it was that the writers and the signatories on that letter, I mean, I think they're actually just misdiagnosing the problem of cancel culture, because what they're saying is that online cancel culture, and let's be clear, they're talking about, in particular, Twitter, right? And the rise of like Black Twitter, as it's called, right? The idea that there's like separate but equal Twitters. But this idea of this online cancel culture is disrupting free conversation, free speech through silencing. I mean, I think that's a kind of gaslighting, right? Because they're basically claiming themselves as victims of this liberal online cancel culture. But cancel culture has always been a tool that people in the establishment, people who actually have official platforms, they've always used cancel culture and silencing as a tool. So like blacklisting, right, was a form of cancel culture. Not allowing people to fully express themselves and silencing and suppressing certain viewpoints has been cancel culture. The New York Times, for instance, didn't talk about AIDS in the 1980s until many, many years after so many gay men had passed away. And so, you know, that's a form of sort of canceling, like a social death, right, of certain kinds of vulnerable communities. And this became an issue also this year with Bari Weiss, the journalist and opinion writer for the New York Times, that she quit the New York Times in July 2020 of this year because she claimed that the Times was muting and silencing voices. And she, again, was blaming liberal call-out culture for it. So she was claiming herself as a victim of workplace discrimination, working in a hostile work environment. She was being bullied. And then I think it was interesting that in her letter that she wrote, that was a critique and why she walked away, she said that Twitter has become the ultimate editor of the New York Times. So the question I have for you is, like, what does it mean to do cultural journalism in an age of Black Twitter, in an age where social media has become incredibly powerful? There's a court of public opinion, and masses of people are going to hold you accountable for your statements. People are going to hold you accountable for your retrograde politics, right?
Well, I thought about this the other night. My wife and I watched this new movie, Mank, the David Fincher movie about Herbert Mankiewicz, who wrote the script for Herman Mankiewicz, who wrote the script for Citizen Kane, and one of the ballsiest scenes in the entire movie is a big speech that Gary Oldman as Mankiewicz has, speaking to William Randolph Hearst in a drunken, sort of court jester type of moment, but a big speech in which he's talking truth to power, and he pays for it. Having seen Mank, we went back and we watched Citizen Kane, which was made in 1942 by Orson Welles, which is the same type of story. This ain't news. This has happened for a long time. The idea that the New York Times, in Barry Weiss's mind, was some type of some kind of golden symbol of wisdom is just wrong and misguided. I think newspapers have been owned by people who have opinions, and there are editors who have opinions who will guide it, and it may go this way, it may go that way for a time. As a journalist, you have a right as a journalist to quit or to work for a newspaper, whatever you want. But ultimately, I think that, in the same way that the doctor takes a Hippocratic oath, you have a duty to stay true to what you believe is the right thing to write. And that ultimately is where, I come down. Barry Weiss had a right to quit the New York Times. Fine. I don't care about that. Anything after that, however, I find, I sometimes tell my writing students, if they get a rejection from a publisher, stop reading after the word no. It just says no. Stop whining. They're going to try and explain, and you're going to whine. Let's just cut that out. And that's what I would just say. If she wants to write a thought out piece about the problems with Twitter, fine. But don't. But if you tie it to your own particular peeve, people are going to really stop listening to you.
But it also struck me that the thing that ties the Harper letter together with what happened at the New York Times, by the way, which is like, to me, part of what's going on in 2020, right, it's also, we're getting a peek at the structures of these newsrooms themselves and who has power, the power relationships. Like, that's something relatively new in terms of the amount of information that we have about what actually, like, the culture of these newsrooms. But it struck me that her critique is really about her concern that she's actually losing the power to define and frame culture, right? That she's losing her ability to become a gatekeeper. Like, how can I use my platform to tell people what is good or bad in culture if you have Black Twitter doing the same? So it's really become about a democratization, right, of like gatekeeper culture, which was formerly just about establishments and people who had the ability to do this work kind of silently, right? They were just like, I mean, even like somebody like Frank Rich at the New York Times, used to be able to open and close a show in the 1980s just with one review, a Broadway show. Mm-hmm. So that era is ending.
Well, this raises a much larger question, which, maybe is the topic for our next conversation, which is, what's the role of journalists in the age of Twitter? That, I think we started off by saying that journalists are looked to now to be explainers, because there's so much stuff out there. There's so much on Twitter, so much on Facebook, so much being put out on social media. Now there's even TikTok journalism that, somehow you look to experts to make sense of all of this, and the experts still have to be journalists. Which leads me to just one other thing, because when you came down to Cartagena, it was thanks to an initiative that I think was long overdue by a group called Critical Minded to encourage more journalists of color, cultural journalists of color, specifically in the United States. But it's a message that I hope resonates also in Latin America, because I know a few years before, when we were doing a program on the Afro-Caribbean culture in the coast in Latin America, that I asked my friends within the Fundación Gabo can you help us find a guest master of color in Colombia? No. In South America? No, there isn't one. And I thought, okay, someone's got a lot of educating to do. Maybe there really isn't anybody, and we need to educate more journalists of color, or maybe we just need to educate ourselves so that we're more in contact with journalists of color. And perhaps, just going back to Barry Weiss, maybe this will be the silver lining in that cloud, which is that this type of, talking about the Harper's letter and about cancel culture and about her response and this idea of Black Twitter or whatever will bring something out, and that there will now be a public discussion, and perhaps a greater awareness of how we receive our journalism.
I think so, for sure. Yeah. Sorry.
Now we've got a few minutes left. I don't know whether there are any questions coming from our audience out there. Oh, okay, good. No questions. Everyone has been entirely on our side. They understand it. But let me ask, another thing, which is that as we're now looking as cultural journalists at the cultural scene, are we seeing things that are really helping us from the art point of view? Pop music happens fairly quickly. Are you seeing anything from the film side? I've seen, recently there was something from the New York Times called the Decameron Project, which was a series of fiction writers, including Edvija Danticat and Margaret Atwood, who wrote stories trying to make it like the Decameron, like Boccaccio's Decameron, stories written during a plague. And I felt, no, this is much too soon for people to write anything of quality about the pandemic. Are you seeing anything, happening in terms of the film world, or in terms of the pop music world that is able to confront it, or are we too soon?
I think there's been some stuff. I mean, I think it's a little bit too soon, because to me, some of the best albums of the year are the ones that were made before the pandemic hit, that were then released and just resonate with issues related to the pandemic and protests and so on. Albums like Dua Lipa's record, Moses Sumney's Gray is a pretty fantastic record. Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters, which was largely made in certain kind of isolation prior to the pandemic. And so therefore, it resonates with ideas about isolation that are relevant to the era of the pandemic. But increasingly, we're seeing more and more work that has been done or created during the pandemic, but it doesn't always address the issues of the pandemic in an outright or explicit way. And I think we're still a little ways off from that, of people being able to really think about the ways in which the contemporary moment has impacted how people think and move through the world, and those sorts of things. We'll probably see more of that to come. But I think of all the kind of emergent models that have happened during the pandemic. So for instance, on Instagram, there was Versus, right, which was the kind of battle between hip hop producers that was started by the producer Timbaland and Swizz Beatz, where they would play their music and sort of battle, quote unquote, battle each other, symbolically battle each other. And this generated a huge audience. Each, once a month or whatever it was, they would do other artists. So they had Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle, for instance, did one. And this attracted, millions of people to watch. And Apple has since picked it up, and now it's become more kind of an official thing. But this is a model that would never have existed prior to the pandemic. If anyone from the music industry had said, you know what I think is going to generate millions of views, Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle sitting on chairs, playing their music for each other and talking, it would never have happened. That's something that's very, very specific to the nature of the pandemic. But
let me ask you, Jason, as a producer as well, who's making the decision for this to happen? Because one of the things I think that many people have hoped, I know in the theater community, within small regional theaters, but I think also on Broadway, there's been a clamor for more representation by people of color, by in the decision-making process at the managerial level, at the producing level, not just in terms of faces on the stage. Also in Hollywood, there's been that feeling that it's not just how many Black actors and actresses, or Asians have nominations this year, but how many studio heads, who is making the decision. And right now that Broadway is dark, let's say, I've been waiting and talking to friends of mine, both in the unions and in the producing side, to hear about how they're going to rejig Broadway so that they can finally come back and not charge $1,000 a ticket and, deal with issues of inequality there. And I don't see any movement whatsoever. But, I'm wondering, when you give this example, are things changing within the pop music industry? Is there going to be, or do you need to have more, do there need to be more managers and producers of color at the top?
I mean, 100%. And I think people have definitely been having those conversations in music. There's a few initiatives. The Show Must Be Paused initiative, started by two Black women executives in the music industry to try to address the histories of structural racism that have dominated the music industry for a long time. The Black Music Action Coalition is another organization that formed in the wake of what happened with George Floyd to really press record labels and music companies to address their own complicity and relationship to racism. So there's initiatives like that that are happening and that are ongoing. But there's also all kinds of other things that are happening in the culture. So for instance, I don't know if you've been reading about the fact that people have been trying to or have been using TikTok to recreate every scene from the movie Ratatouille. Which I think is like, that's something that's like an emergent thing that has come out of the pandemic and come out of this moment, right? Is people can't go to Broadway, but they're finding ways to recreate the feeling of Broadway in their own way using technology. And that's happening across the board. That's definitely happening in music, where live stream concerts have become the only way for a lot of artists to be able to reach their fans. And so clearly there's a kind of top-down process where that's happening, with artists like Dua Lipa and Billie Eilish and so on doing very formally constructed, produced, high production value live stream concerts. But then there's also just people on Instagram who have risen to the top just by going direct, right? And going on Instagram Live and just doing concerts that way, or Facebook Live or YouTube or whatever else. I can think of this in terms of my own work that I do. I started a pop-up series this summer with NPR Music, in which I would just interview music celebrities that interested me. People like Moses Sumney and others. Dua Lipa I interviewed. And this series was in relationship to the Pop Conference, which is produced every year out of the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle. But since it didn't happen this year physically, we decided to just kind of improvise and put together a pop-up series. And so this literally just meant me sitting in my living room talking to superstars in music about their work.
Can you monetize something like this, Jason? I mean, in the sense that, is this a way for new producers who don't go through the system to be able to make a living and to be able to sign artists and to, or at least be able to make money off of music and make money for the artists as well, who aren't giving concerts?
I mean, I think something like Versus is an interesting model where it wasn't about the economics. It was just really two producers who are friends who wanted to battle each other online and have people watch. Teddy Riley, the legendary producer of artists like Michael Jackson and others, got together with Babyface to do the same thing, the legendary R&B producer. And now it's become something that's monetizable. They created a business structure around it. But at first, it was just a kind of emergent model of people just getting together. D-Nice, the DJ, started doing DJ sets online. And then, people started watching and gathering on Instagram. And suddenly 1 million people were watching. And he's since elevated himself as a major star in the world of DJing. Louis Vega, the legendary record producer and DJ from the group Masters at Work, does these lockdown sessions on a regular basis and has just generated a huge fan base doing online DJ concerts. We would never have seen this before. So I'm just emboldened and fascinated by the rise of all of this culture that's happening, and yet at the same time deeply concerned about people's artists' ability to sustain themselves economically, because again, the pandemic has demonstrated to us how precarious artists live. Just one, you know, check away from not being able to feed themselves. It's very strange time.
Yeah, I think we've still got a minute or so for a couple of questions. We had Douglas Portati asked for you, Jason, that he wants to know about woke money, pink money, black money, artists that try to take a ride on social issues, but when the real fight starts, they hide themselves. What do you think of them?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I wrote a piece for Pitchfork this year during the pandemic on the changing role of artists in popular music, as it relates to the pandemic and as it relates to the racial justice protests that we saw in the US in June, talking about the ways in which artists are changing. And I was inspired to do that because the pop music star Janelle Monáe had created a Instagram post where she said, "I want to let you know I'm not a real activist." Even though she's had a long history doing activist music, she says, "I'm not a real activist compared to what activists who are part of social justice organizations and who have really been doing the work on the ground, activists, organizers, mobilizers, they're the most important people. And I want to shine some light on them." So I thought this was interesting that you were seeing a trend where artists are actually taking a backseat to activists, to organizers, to mobilizers, and saying, let's support them. My job as a pop music artist is to amplify the work of progressive social justice organizations, but to not put myself in the front. And that's different than what we saw, let's say, with Live Aid in the 1980s, where artists were sort of leading the charge, right? And there is a history of artists who have been organizers, who have been mobilizers, people like Paul Robeson and Harry Belafonte and others, but it's a kind of minor history. For the most part, we've had artists like Bono of U2 and so on, who have been the stars, who have been, you know, the political figures, you know, pop music stars as political figures. And increasingly, you're not seeing that. You're seeing people turning over their Instagram accounts with their 2 million fans, 5 million fans, 10 million fans, turning it over to scholars, to activists, to organizers to do the real work. So that said, Douglas, to answer your question, I think that there is this whole notion of activism as fashion. And we saw this in the summer, right, with corporations in the aftermath of George Floyd that would like put up a black square on their Instagram accounts or like write a slogan, but then do nothing more. And artists have done the same thing. You know, I see that activism is big, so I better become an activist. And I also better start saying the things that my fans are likely going to want me to hear. So I think of that as activism as fashion. But at the same time, audiences are increasingly holding artists accountable for doing more than just making a statement. What are you actually doing? How much money have you actually given? I remember Virgil Abloh, the founder of you know, major fashion company and creative director behind Louis Vuitton, had donated some money for social justice causes, for racial justice causes. But I think he gave a very small amount, like $50. And this guy's, you know, he's got millions and millions of dollars. And his fans went after him and said, how come you're not putting more money out there, right? Like, people are holding people accountable for their commitment to these issues in a way that I think is really interesting. And again, very different than what we've seen before. Jonathan, do you want to add anything?
Well, no, I mean, I'm just, you know, the dog in the manger, just figuring that people are going to want to see something for their buck as well, that they're not only going to want to see their stars, you know, give money to these causes, they're going to want to see these causes actually make things better. And, you know, I think this is one of the things that we're looking towards after January 20th. Everyone's going to expect that instantly everything is going to be much better when we have a new administration, in the same way that, you know, if we have more black faces, if we have a black, you know, Secretary of Defense, that all of a sudden, you know, all war is going to stop, and the police will see that this is the way things are at the top of the chain, and will be nicer to people of color in the United States. And I think that, you know, fans who are expecting these things of their stars are perhaps going to be in for a rude awakening. And that as you say, the quieter activism that we had in in earlier times. Not that Harry Belafonte, I would say, was quiet. I mean, he was extremely active. Or Joan Baez, who marched in Montgomery with James Baldwin, or any number of Woody Guthrie with his guitar that had written on it, "This guitar kills fascists." We're living, and perhaps this goes back to what we were talking about with cancel cultures. We're living in an age of heightened expectations and immediate gratification, and life don't happen that way.
Yeah. And if you say nothing, if an artist doesn't say anything at this point, then that's evidence of their complicity with oppressive culture. It's like, so that happened to Taylor Swift, for instance, where she didn't want to face the same consequences that the Dixie Chicks had faced in country music, where they spoke out about George Bush in the early 2000s, around 2003, and they were canceled in the culture. Radio wouldn't play them. Labels, were no longer interested in them. The country music industry decided to cancel them and try to eradicate them from the culture, but they came back, of course. So Taylor Swift, as one of the biggest pop stars of the last 10 years, did not want to suffer that same fate. And so she decided to basically be apolitical in many, many ways. But then she decided she had to say something, because by not saying something, it looked like she was complicit with the worst abuses of the administration.
Well, in a way, though, you can't blame her. If we look at the history, let's say, of the last 40 years, in my mind, the two worst presidents that we've had in the United States were cultural figures. One was a movie star, and the other one was a reality TV star. And so we might be forgiven by, or we should look at ourselves as a culture that looks to our stars as being people that we should look up to for political answers and for social answers as well. And maybe, just let them make good art. And what they do on the side. I mean, this is a little bit of a devil's advocate position, but I worry, and I'm not the first one to worry. If you look at Day of the Locusts by back in the 1920s, we've looked to our stars and we've asked them to do too much for a long, long time.
And that's been a major change recently. But I do think people are thinking more about how their celebrity can be managed, how it can be used, how it can be deployed in ways that they wouldn't have deployed it before. And that's an interesting thing. And I mean, it ties into this other question. So I don't know if you want to just mention, it's thinking about the role of reggaeton singers in the culture.
Yeah.
I think this is incredibly important when you think about artists like Residente and Bad Bunny, Ricky Martin and others, and what they were able to do in terms of using their celebrity or deploying their celebrity to shift the way that people were thinking about Ricardo Rossello in Puerto Rico. That was huge. Bad Bunny is a different type of pop star than we've seen before. Somebody who maintains artistic credibility and commercial credibility, and has been a political activist and an organizer on the ground. I think he represents difference, and there are others who are in that same mold, who are doing that kind of work. So I think it's fascinating to track this stuff and to see what
a corollary to that point about reggaeton is one of our alumni from the Becca Gabo program, Teresita Goyeneche, from Cartagena, wrote a very interesting article this year about a champeta performance in the Teatro Mejia, which is this sort of Rococo. I don't know if you saw it when you were in Cartagena, this sort of Rococo zarzuela theater. And the only way that a champeta group called El Imperio was able to get in there was because this was during the time of pandemic. And there was a lot of opposition from essentially the white community in Cartagena against champeta, which is essentially a culture of poorer, darker skinned people, to having them come into the Teatro Mejia in the first place. They said, the speakers are going to be too big. They're going to, destroy the inside of the theater and all the rest of it. But it was only because of the pandemic that they were actually able to get in there and then live stream their performance and get thousands and thousands of people into the center of Cartagena, which they ordinarily wouldn't have gone into. We've got another question. We haven't yet gotten the hook, so I guess we'll keep talking. From Nancy Buenahora, who asked, have you ever been marginalized by a media outlet because of your position or because of cultural activism? I guess this is for you, Jason.
Or you.
Or me. I've been, the nature of being a writer is being marginalized every single day. I mean, you have to, journalists have to fight for, for their pieces. They have to pitch them all the time. There have been plenty of times that I've had my opinions pushed back against me, often by, let's say I've gone and done an investigative journalism piece and it hasn't come up with the political line that the magazine wanted. Years ago, I can think I wrote a piece about Lori Berenson, who had been sentenced to prison for life in Peru for having been accused of being a terrorist. And I found out some information when I was down in Peru that didn't quite hew to the party line of The Nation magazine, which published it. But the great thing then, and this was in the year 2000, is that the editor of The Nation was a guy named Victor Novaski, who was fantastic. And he realized we're there, that we exist in order to put forward even opinions that we don't necessarily want to believe, or to put forward evidence that we didn't know existed. And he ran the piece without any trouble. Now, did I have a piece published again in The Nation? Well, 15 years later, I got another piece published in The Nation. But, that's the nature of the game. And you can't, again, going back to what we were talking about with Barry Weiss, I feel it doesn't make sense to whine. You just look for another center if you've been marginalized.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I've never been outright canceled. But again, I think part of the issue of cancel culture is that sometimes we don't know if we've been canceled. We just suddenly don't get the calls anymore from the publication that we were writing for, maybe because something we wrote angered an advertiser or upset somebody who has a relationship with a celebrity. So that definitely happened to me at a publication I was writing for in the 2000s. Where I was critical of an album that I was reviewing, and the editor did not want me to be so critical of the album and went so far as to actually change some of the language, and I pushed back against it. And I didn't write for that publication anymore because the editor had deemed it more important to maintain a relationship with the label, with the artist, than to maintain the integrity of the writing and their relationship with me. But I think one of the things we have realized in this age of Me Too and Black Lives Matter and so on, is all of the ways in which people have been canceled silently and are only finding out now through investigation, through reporting. I'm thinking about Janet Jackson, the great global pop star, who had a wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl a number of years ago. And while performing with Justin Timberlake, it was a huge moment. It was a controversial moment, and she suffered a lot career-wise. She definitely came back, but never at the level that she was before. And many people chalk this up to age, or they said, well, she's in her 40s, 50s. Women may not be able to sustain their pop success at that age in the way that they did before. So maybe that explains it. People try to come up with all kinds of rationale for it. But one of the things we learned is that Les Moonves, who was the head of CBS, when the wardrobe malfunction happened and when the television station got sued, and they had to pay a huge fine for Janet Jackson's exposing of her breast on national TV, he decided that he was going to go out and cancel her career. And he called people up and said, let's make sure that she never again is heard from in the way that she was before. And so that was a strategic and deliberate attempt to try to limit and to marginalize somebody in the music industry on the basis of something relatively arbitrary. And one of the things Me Too has shown is that that has happened so many times. So many people have been written off. So many journalists have been blacklisted. So many journalists have been canceled because of their viewpoints, because of the things that they've written. And we just never heard about it. It was all suppressed and there was no outlet to be able to talk about these things. And now there is. People are revealing, you know, how the sausage is made. They're showing us, you know, the structural issues that determine how people get to write, people's voices get out there or don't get out there.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hoping is that, you know, there's certain political examples that we can all agree on, but then when it comes down to certain social things that matter to us, all of a sudden we're on the other side. I mean, in Colombia, you know, in Bogota, you know, those of you know that the entire editorial staff of Semana quit last month because of positions by the owners of the newspaper. Or closer to home in the United States, for those of you who keep wondering, why is it that Mitch McConnell and the Republican Senate have still to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the presidential election on November 3rd? It's because they're all afraid of being canceled by Trump supporters. And yet, you know, sometimes we need to look at the mirror and turn that back to ourselves and say, okay, if we don't want to, if we want to bring common sense back into the argument, let's be, you know, let's ask these questions of ourselves at the same time. In any case, Jason, I think we're now at the end of our time. So let me thank you very much. Let me also say to the audience to invite you to stay for the next event, which is Contar Historias Ajenas, which is a conversation between the Ecuadorian journalist Sabrina Duque and the Pulitzer Prize-winning U.S. writer Benjamin Moser, who's the author of a controversial biography of Susan Sontag. And I say controversial in only the best sense of the word, and that people should argue about it. But meanwhile, thank you very much, Jason. I hope it's not another year before I see you again. But on behalf of Jason King in New York and myself in Rome, buenas tardes, buenas noches, and goodbye. Thank you all very much.
Gracias. Thank you, Jonathan.